and welcome to Theology Matters. This is Dr. John Clark, and today we want to continue our look and study of the Sermon on the Mount. And last session, we basically introduced the study. We began to really just discuss how popular this sermon is, this teaching of Jesus found in Matthew chapter 5, 6, and 7, and also just how widely misabused, used, first of all, and then misabused, misapplied sermon that is probably recorded in the Bible in our day. In fact, what many people have done is tried to hijack the Sermon on the Mount and make it a message that is directly applicable to church age believers. And it fits really what's going on in our world today, this social justice type movement or ideas. And so the Sermon on the Mount really gives some footing to people who already lean maybe toward those social justice components or ideas as it relates to what they view as the primary role of the Church of Jesus Christ in our day and age. And so last week we looked at really kind of just gave an overview of the book of Matthew and really just detailing that the book of Matthew is largely about the presentation of the kingdom of God on earth through the appearance of God's dear Son, the Messiah, Jesus Christ. And we noted that even at the beginning part of the book, until he's rejected officially by the national leaders in chapters 12 and 13, or towards the end of chapter 12, that he and John the Baptist's main message is a presentation of God's kingdom on earth. And so much of his teaching, as we kind of left off last week, is directed to the children of Israel. In fact, what we find is as we look at the immediate audience of the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew 5, 1 and 2, we saw that the disciples were there. And then as we jump to the end of the message, we see that the people were there. There was a multitude there. They were astonished, it said, at his teaching. And so there were more than just the disciples there. This was a message to the nation of Israel and who was listening at this time. And it's very important to note that at this point in Jesus' ministry, his attention had not yet turned to a Gentile audience. In fact, if we jump forward even a few chapters, look at Matthew chapter 10, verses 5 through 7, because we're going to see that even in Matthew chapter 10, which follows the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus's message had still not turned, or his ministry had still not turned to a Gentile audience. In fact, Matthew chapter 10, verses 5 through 7, it says, "These 12 Jesus sent out and commanded them, saying, Do not go into the way of the Gentiles, and do not enter a city of the Samaritans, but go rather to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. And as you go, preach, saying, The kingdom of heaven is at hand." And so that is the message that Jesus and John the Baptist and his disciples preached early on in the Gospels when he was making a presentation offer of the kingdom to the nation. This sounds, Matthew chapter 10 is in stark contrast to Matthew 28, which is the Great Commission. He says, go into all the world and make disciples, right? Mark 16, go preach the gospel in all the world. So there's definitely a shift or a change in Jesus's ministry from the beginning of Matthew and towards the end. And so that's what we're recognizing here in terms of context. If he's still giving a message that's specifically being given to the nation of Israel when we get to Matthew chapter 10, we have to take that into account when we interpret the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew 5 through 7. And again, his focus point at this point in his ministry is still the presentation of the long awaited promised Jewish earthly kingdom to the Jewish nation. And so as we work our way through the Sermon on the Mount, you'll notice the word brethren. It's the Greek word adelphos. It's used 8 times in the Sermon on the Mount. But when we look at it, typically, in fact, when we get to the epistles, we see the word brethren, we automatically think church age believer. But when we're in the Sermon on the Mount, because the audience, the direct audience is the Jewish nation, this is who he's addressing, we need to view the term brethren as referring to Jewish brethren, not the church. And in fact, if we do that, it clears up some passages in there. I've heard many people use Matthew 5, 23 and 24 as a communion passage. They'll say, yeah, therefore, if you bring your gift to the altar and there remember that your brother has something against you, leave your gift there before the altar and go your way. First be reconciled to your brother and then come and offer your gift. And many people will quote that as a means by which you're disqualified from taking communion. Well, it has nothing to do with communion. He's not talking about church age believers there. He's talking about Jewish believers. And so we'll get to verse 24 and try to clear up the explanation there. And so that's kind of a point that we want to take in. One kind of caution, though, is even though the Sermon on the Mount has a distinctively Jewish audience, there are certain righteous principles, what we'd call transdispensational principles, which can be applied even in the church age. And, the scriptures are very clear about just wiping out entire sections of the Bible and saying, oh, those just because those don't apply directly to us, then they have no meaning to me, or I can't gain anything out of that. Romans 15:4 would tell us that whatever things were written before were written for our learning, that we, through the patience and comfort of the scriptures, might have hope. And so, even if something in the Bible is not applicable directly to us, in other words, it wasn't directly intended for us to apply in our certain situation, there's still value in it. And that's one of the reasons that we we want to talk about the Sermon on the Mount because there's value in it. We don't want to just throw it away, but at the same time, we want to recognize, really most importantly, the correct interpretation of the sermon. Robert Thomas says this: principles of application are subjectively derived and can be good or bad, but application must be kept separate from interpretation. In other words, application is not an integral part of hermeneutics. So what is he basically saying there? Well, he's basically saying this: when we come to the Sermon on the Mount, our primary goal, our initial goal in any Bible study should always be, what is the interpretation, before we start trying to apply it to our lives. In fact, when you start to apply the Bible without first interpreting the Bible, you can come up with some very random and incorrect applications. And so we just want to be very careful as we consider the interpretation for the Sermon on the Mount. That's why we're spending so much time here at the beginning considering the context of the sermon. And so as we look at the Sermon on the Mount, the build up to the Sermon on the Mount has been simply this: it's the presentation of the gospel of the kingdom in Matthew 3, 1 through 12 by John the Baptist. We see the baptism of Jesus in Matthew 3, 13 through 17. This is, again, Jesus' identification with John's message. He's identifying not only with John's message, but he's identifying with the repentant remnant of Israel, those who hear John's message that they need to change their mind about how they're going to enter the kingdom of heaven. And Jesus really summarizes that well for Nicodemus in John chapter 3. He says, unless one is born again, he shall never enter the kingdom of heaven. And so Jews had a misconception in that day as it related to how they were getting into the kingdom. Many of them thought that because of their physical birth, they were Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob's sons, they were automatically getting in. Or they thought, because I'm circumcised, I'm automatically getting in. Or because they thought I'm a son of the covenant and I try to keep the law, I'm automatically getting in. And John the Baptist was saying, you guys need to change your mind about entrance into the kingdom. You have to put your faith in the coming Messiah, the promised deliverer from Genesis 3:15, the one spoken of Abraham. In you, in your seed, all nations of the earth would be blessed. They needed to believe in God's method of righteousness and stop trusting in their own righteousness to get there. And so we see the message of John in Matthew 3, 1 through 12. We see the baptism of Jesus in Matthew 3, 13 through 17. We see the testing of Jesus in the wilderness by Satan in Matthew 4, 1 through 11. And this testing simply validated and verified who he was, the fact that he was able to withstand that type of testing in the wilderness. And then we witnessed the beginning of Jesus's public teaching and healing ministry in Matthew 4, 12 through 25. And as you go through that section, you'll notice that he's beginning his in the beginning of his ministry, he's preaching the gospel of the kingdom. Everywhere he goes, he's got a focus and an emphasis on Jewish synagogues, and he's what's accompanying his teaching is verifying and validated healings of every kind. Remember, the Messiah, as prophesied in the Old Testament, was going to perform certain miraculous features and functions, and Jesus was doing those very miracles that the Old Testament said the Messiah would do. That was designed to validate the things he was saying, to validate his identity, to verify him to the people. Okay, and so that's very important to understand that this is the lead up to Matthew 5, 6, and 7. It's all kingdom focus, it's all validating who the king is. It's verifying and validating his message. And now he's going to lay down his teaching here in Matthew 5, 6, and 7 as it relates to the kingdom of heaven that he's offering. Now, one of the things that we find when we come to the New Testament, as we turn the pages into the New Testament, is that God had made commitments to Israel, which at this point in time had remained unrealized at the closing of the Old Testament. Some of those commitments, obviously, was that he would send a king to reign among them, that he would provide them, that he would be a blessing to them, that they would experience a blessing. They were waiting for this new covenant where their hearts would be changed. They would be changed to hearts of flesh, not of stone. That every man would know the Lord from the least to the greatest. That he would reorient them to the land, that they would own the land, which was not the case in Jesus's time because the Romans had dominated the land. In fact, the land had been dominated by Gentiles since the kingdom of Babylon. That was part of the prophecy in Daniel 2. And so some of these commitments that he had made to Israel had not yet been fulfilled. In addition, Israel had made commitments to God's demands under law, which remained unmet. They had been failing in their commitments to God. And so during the times of the Gentiles, Israel's experience under Gentile rule, which was introduced when the people of God went into captivity, remained to be resolved. That was still the case. The Romans were in charge. And so what we find is that this earthly kingdom that was promised in the Old Testament would provide the ultimate and final fulfillment of all three provisions of the Abrahamic covenant. And when we talk about the three provisions of the Abrahamic covenant, we're talking about land, seed, and blessing. And so this is what Jesus and his coming was designed to offer Israel, was the ultimate and final fulfillment of these three provisions in the Abrahamic covenant. And we'll continue there in our next session.